everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Perfect RIA Podcast, What Works Wednesday edition. I am your host, Matthew Jarvis, and with me today is the legendary, I will say legendary, Brandon, because I've followed your work for a little bit, the legendary Brendan Frazier. And of course, you've got a book that's out, you've got your own podcast, you've got a lot of stuff that's going on. Really impressed with your work. Excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, well, not only legendary from that standpoint, but legendary because there's the actor Brendan Frazier, right, who often gets confused with me. So legendary from a bunch of different angles, I suppose. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Well, you've been talking a lot about behavioral finance, a lot about how advisors. I don't want to call it the softer side. I think too often behavioral finance is considered like the softer side of financial planning. But I really think, in my experience, if you don't have that part dialed in, nothing else will matter. Like if you can't communicate effectively with a client and understand why they're adverse to the market, nothing else is going to matter.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And it's funny you say that because I also have this like natural, I don't know where it came from, but some sort of natural aversion to calling it the soft side of finance or like even behavioral finance. I don't think it really incorporates everything that we want to try to encompass in the term. I think behavioral finance sort of, it elicits these thoughts around biases, right? And you think about books like Nudge and those types of things where you're thinking, okay, yeah, like people are irrational. They have biases and that's behavioral finance in a nutshell. So, I mean, I don't know what the best term is. The term that I've tried to use to try to promote to get out there is the idea of like the human side of money or the human side of advice, trying to incorporate not just biases, right? Not just building trust, not just changing behavior, but trying to get them all under one roof to where it, in a way that almost makes sense.
Yeah, that they're not different pieces, right? It's like one piece, right? There's finance, there's money, but it's all psychology, it's all behavior, it's everything, it's all tied together.
Yeah, I think then the other best way I've heard it encompassed is just called the psychology of financial planning. Like they are their own individual components under the umbrella, but they all make it. There's all these different elements that come with dealing with emotional human beings when you're talking about an emotionally charged topic like money.
Yeah. Now, Brendan, I'm curious. So I've been in the industry now 20 years. Grew up like a lot of us did on a real sales side, and this was often like poo-pooed, like, oh yeah, the guys that don't have practices that aren't making any money, like they can talk about these softer, they can have these softer discussions. But as I've sort of matured in the industry, and again, you're kind of leading the front charge of this. These are essential discussions. These aren't optional discussions. These aren't if you run out of something to talk about. This is really like 101 stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, most people have the realization at some point when they've been in the industry long enough where they go, wait a minute, hang on. A lot of these people that have the type of practices that are growing, that are booming, the people that have the best relationships with their clients, that are doing the most rewarding work, they've essentially done that. They've figured that out. They've mastered the human side, if you will. Now, they may not have set out to do that, right? It comes more naturally to some people, but we tend to look up, you see certain people, certain practices, the way that they have their clients live their lives, and you think, man, you know what? Like they're doing something different. It's not just about delivering a financial plan. It's not just about constructing a portfolio. They're taking it to another level. And then what you find out, what you learn when you talk to them is they realize, yeah, I realized pretty early on that my job wasn't just about constructing plans and portfolios. There's an element of being able to deconstruct thoughts and feelings and emotions and values. And not only is it better for business, but it also makes for more meaningful, rewarding work. Your clients are, it creates better outcomes for clients. So the idea is, hey, most people realize it. When they get there later on, they've kind of done it on accident, right? So what if we can try to bring some of that into a framework sooner so that you can start implementing it, applying it, using it, and then you don't have to look back later on and go, I hope I did it right, but you can start packaging these things into something that makes sense to build towards that from the beginning.
I love that. How would I recognize, or how would an advisor recognize in their own practice that they're weak in this area? They have room for, like I could think, like if a client comes to me, a prospect comes, and they say, Jarvis, I have this tax situation. Like I know either I know the answer to that or I don't know. But can you think of someone like, wait a second, if this is happening with your clients or prospects, it probably means you need to up your game on the psychology side.
Yes, that's a great question. And the problem is there ways to try to track it and quantify it so that you'll know that that's the case, right? Kind of like think of it like a speed limit. Is there a way to have something, to have the feedback that says, hey, I'm going too fast? Is there a way to say, hey, I need to work in these areas? Yes, but it's going to require tracking and monitoring things that maybe you don't always track and monitor. Like, for example, what percentage of the time are you talking in a meeting with a client compared to what percentage of the time are they talking? Are there ways to do that? Yeah, there's software that can do it on these virtual meetings now. There's you can upload the hard file into software and it'll break that down for you.
Oh,
But do most
interesting.
people do that? No, right? Because it's just hard to do, right? It's how often what I always say is advisors don't need to be tracking like clients and growth. What we should also, well, you do need to track that. What we should also be tracking is their implementation rate. So what percentage of the advice that you're giving is actually being acted upon and implemented? Because at the end of the day, advice that's not implemented is pretty much useless, right? All it is just words on a page. It's just advice, but it doesn't create the result and the outcome. So we should be tracking implementation rate. I don't know of anybody, for that matter, that actually does that. So what I always say is, if nothing else, if you want to try to assess, is there something I could get better at? I haven't met anybody that has it down. No, literally, there's nobody out there that can say, hey, I'm the master at everything that goes into the human side of money and the human side of advice. There's always something that you can work on.
Yeah, that's interesting. The idea of having the software analyze how much you're speaking versus how much they're speaking. That would be kind of a fun exercise. Now I'm actually tempted to do that.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything super objective. I mean, some subjective things come up like, are to your point on implementation, like if clients aren't implementing your advice, are you clear on why they're not, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's easy to say like, well, they don't get it, right? Like, oh, they just don't get it. They're just not very smart. At the end of the day, like you didn't give them a compelling reason that resonated for them. And that's a good reminder. Like, all right, if a client didn't implement my advice, and short of having like a super objective reason, like, well, Matthew, actually, we had this other variable we didn't tell you. Short of that, I've got to look back and say, all right, somewhere I didn't communicate this effectively.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly. And you said it right, which is we tend to think that when you give somebody advice that they don't follow through on, we just tend to label it as like, oh, they're not a great client.
Yep.
They don't care, right? But we don't take a step back and think like, what role did we play in the non-adherence of the advice that we gave, right? And oftentimes, no, in fact, every time there's always a reason. So I always say spend less time telling people what to do and more time understanding why they haven't done it. And I think something that's kind of important to, if we take a step back and go outside of our industry, if you look at medication prescriptions, there's stats out there
Sure.
that say when somebody's given a prescription for a medication from their doctor, 50% of those people won't actually follow the regimented plan for taking the medication. 25% don't even go pick up the prescription. They don't even go get the medicine. So this is, and that's what we're talking about, a matter of health, right? This is your life and being
Life
healthy.
or death.
So we almost have to, or not almost, I think we need to be able to operate from the assumption that the advice that we're giving is more likely not to be implemented and acted upon. Now, you're always going to have the people that just they're ahead of the game. They check off all the boxes, right? But we almost need to start designing and delivering advice in a way that's with the mindset of, okay, they're probably not going to implement. So what can we do to make it easier? What barriers can we remove to improve the actual follow through of the advice?
I like that mindset. Like, hey, if I'm coming into this, they're probably not going to implement my advice. I've really got to up my game on being compelling. Me showing them a 40-page financial plan, that's not going to increase the odds of them implementing. Me being empathetic and seeing why it is they're worried the market's going to go down or what concerns they have, that could really move the needle.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Like, hey, odds are they're not going to follow my advice, not because it's me, but just because that's how we just are as humans, and to be empathetic and aware of that.
Yeah, and Tim Maurer, who I had on the podcast recently, he has this term that I like, and I've now stolen from him, but he calls it, you have two types of recommendations: advisor-driven recommendations or client-inspired recommendations, where the client, you've actually cultivated conviction in the client to where it's their idea to do what they need to do. It's not you telling them, right? You've sort of guided them, but they're the ones that feel convicted about what they're supposed to do next, and they've told you that's what they want to do. So anybody that has kids sees this on a regular basis, right? You can ask your kids, hey, do you want a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch? No, right? And you're going, what? I thought you loved peanut butter and jelly. You're like, what do you want? And they're like, yeah, they'll say a couple other things, and eventually they come back around. They're like, I want peanut butter and jelly for lunch. And you're going, wait a minute. I just told you that, but they don't. The idea doesn't need to be yours, or the idea needs to be theirs, not yours, right? Because somebody else's ideas, the client's ideas, are always going to be better than your ideas, no matter what. So if you can make it somebody else's idea and cultivate the conviction that it's the right thing to do in their mind instead of telling them what to do, that's one of the most powerful things you can do on the path to changing somebody's behavior to actually implement and follow through on advice.
Well, I love that. And I mean, let's look at something as simple as like a Roth conversion, right? Like we might look on paper and say, man, a Roth conversion makes total sense. Like here's the numbers, here's the tax benefits of it, here's the arbitrage, the whole thing. But to your point, Brandon, if you've got to tie it back to like, what's the client's like number one thing? Like, what are they ultimately trying to accomplish? At the end of
Right.
the day, yes, I suppose they should care about the tax savings over 40 years. That's not really it. Like, there's something that they're looking for. Make sure my grandkids can go to college. Make sure I don't run out of money. Like, how do we tie it back to what they actually care about?
Yeah, because it's not about, no matter what you think, no matter what it looks like, it's not about the Roth conversion. And I'll even
Never.
take it a step further. It's not about the Roth conversion is going to accumulate more wealth, right? It's not even about accumulating more wealth. It's not about having more money. It's more about what does the accumulation of wealth do? What is it that they want from more money, right? So it's almost, you almost have to take a, or not almost, what I would say, what I've seen done really well that I like, that this will be a potential, or it'll be for one action item, is if you use an implementation sheet for clients, if you have any step of your process where you lay out implementation steps or action items, things to do next in the financial plan, all you have to do is add a little column in there, add a little section in there for the purpose or the reason why you're doing it, right? So Roth conversion, due by this date, who assigned to who needs to do what do we need to do? Oh, and why are we doing it? Oh, well, we're doing it so that you can retire in 5 years. We're doing it so that you can spend more time with your family sooner, right? Whatever it is that their purpose is, whatever their why is, all you have to do is get it in there and remind them why they're doing it. And all of a sudden, it becomes a client-inspired, purpose-driven recommendation instead of just words on a piece of paper.
Yeah, I love that. I think one thing that advisors really have to be careful of here, and I'd love your thoughts on this. I've seen advisors, and it makes me cringe, where they'll use the client's concerns as leverage against them, right? Like the classic example would be like, you told me you love your family, why aren't you buying life insurance? Like that would be a really cringeworthy example.
Right.
But this isn't about knowing their exploits to exploit them. It's like, hey, listen, what is really at the core of all your decisions, and how do we support that? Not how do we manipulate you based on that.
Yeah, so this comes up more often than I realize, more often than I think. I guess I tend to operate in this world, in this bubble where people wouldn't use this stuff to exploit clients. But I guess I need to be more open-minded to the fact that it's going to happen. I like to think that those people, those that are listening to this show and this podcast, probably aren't in that crowd. But you're right. Like these are powerful techniques. These are things that actually change people's behavior, get them that they write about in books to get people to do what they're supposed to do, to improve sales, for example. So they can be used for evil, but in the work that we do, our job is to help clients change their behavior for the good, right? To get the outcome that they want. And so it's knowing some of these powerful forces to use for good that we're almost, I would say we have a responsibility to know those as just as much as we do the knowledge around how to do a Roth conversion.
Yeah, you really do. And I think, Brandon, I think you're right. The listeners of my show, of your show, right, these are top-level financial planners that really care deeply about clients. But your clients are coming up against those sales tactics, right? There's people out there that are very good at identifying these pain points and then exploiting them. And if you if you haven't built this relationship capital, like if you're not talking about their goals and someone else is, even if that person, this is where I hear it, Brandon, they say, "Oh, I can't believe my client just bought this terrible product, like this absolute garbage." Yeah, well, that guy or gal was the first person that found their pain point. Now they exploited it. That's a different discussion, but they were the first person to find it, and you never found it.
Yep. No, you're exactly right, right? The instinct is to, once again, the instinct is to look first to blame the client, right? Like, well, if they had just trusted me more and given me their assets, if they hadn't gone looking for this, if they had just taken it, or if they had taken my advice and moved all their assets to me, this would have never happened, right? Well, okay, well, there's probably a reason why they felt compelled to not only talk to the other person, but to then be convinced to do something that you know that they shouldn't do. But you hit it on the head. I mean, I think that's the best way to say it, which is that person found something, whether it's a pain point, an emotional trigger, a purpose, a value. They found the thing that you didn't find that you can use for good. It just so happens that they used it for evil.
Yeah, I love it. Brendan, how do advisors get better at this? Right, like I think you said earlier, we said before we hit record, some advisors just kind of get it. It's like in their soul. They're naturally very empathetic. They get that. For those of us that aren't necessarily, of course, your podcast, The Human Side of Money, is a great resource. But where would people start on this?
Yeah, it's another popular question, another very common question, right? And I think what most people, when they ask, what they're looking for is like, how can I make this happen today? And this is one of my least favorite parts about being in this world and doing some coaching and training around it. Is it's one of those things that you can't just have immediate transformation to do it really, really well. Like, it's one of those things that takes time, it takes absorbing and learning, and it takes practice. I think the first thing that I would say is just like start by consuming information. Start by learning a little bit more about it, by looking around the industry and who are those people out there that are doing good work in this space, like Shaping Wealth, Brian Portnoy and Neil Beige, Michael Kitsis on Nerd's Eye View. Like they have a ton of great stuff. Megan Lertz, I think, is doing some of the best work in the entire industry right now on the human side of money and the human side of advice. Derek Tharp does a great job on there as well. So, clearly, naturally, Michael's leading the charge on this, which should tell us that there's something to be said for it, right? Daniel Crosby has a podcast called Standard Deviation. So I think you have to start first by learning, by absorbing, by gaining an understanding. And then what you'll start to see from there is it becomes clear what you need to work on next, what step you need to go to next. And this is where, when we do these trainings with advisors, this is everybody's part of the presentation, or not the presentation, but the training where they cringe a little bit, which is when I mentioned, like, hey, guys, we got to practice, right? You can't become a better listener, a better communicator without practicing, right? You can't say I want to be a better listener and walk into a room and all of a sudden be a completely different person with transformed listening skills. It takes actually using it and applying it and practicing it. And that's my least favorite thing. I wish I could snap my fingers and have the way to become this great communicator and question asker and listener that can uncover important information and build instant trust and rapport and change people's behavior. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to boil it down to that yet. But if I do, I'll come back to you and we'll debut it on this show because that's what everybody wants to know.
That's what everybody wants to know. But we have to recognize that it's a complex skill, just like if I ask you, like, how do I learn to do backflips on my mountain bike tomorrow? Like, I can't just give you one thing to learn how to do backflip. Like, that's just not possible. Like, right. I'm looking at your bookshelf behind you. I love books as well, right? Influenced by Robert Cialdini. You just have to make this a priority, and you really have to dive deep on it. It's not something there's not like 5 phrases you can learn. There's 500 that you need to know and need to be able to really intuit. Like, wait a second, the client just leaned back and crossed their arms when I said childhood. Now, hang on a second. Maybe there's something going on here. Mm-hmm. All right, how do I get them to open up on this without prying, without et cetera?
Yeah, and what I would also say to that is most often books themselves aren't even going to really teach you that, right? Like, I can learn and study all I want about aquadynamic theory, but if I've never if I've never been in a pool before, how about that? And I just jump in with all the knowledge around aquadynamic theory, I'm not going to be able to just start moving my arms and swimming from one end of the pool to the other. It takes work and it takes practice applying what you're learning. But you're right, like, even just starting with the base level of knowledge opens your eyes to all the possibilities and what you can work on and start practicing to get better at.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate these insights. This podcast, like all of our podcasts, is about taking action. And the action that stands out to me right out of the gates is to use your example of how much time are you spending talking versus the other person. I'm going to go check out the software. I think that's really cool. I would as easily just say, take your wristwatch and reverse it the other way so it throws you off that it's on like the other hand. And just every time you notice that, like, all right, in this discussion, how much time am I spending talking versus the other person? And this could be with your spouse, it could be with a client, with your team, and really be aware of, all right, how much time am I speaking versus the other person?
Yeah, so I'll add this. Moira Summers, in her book Advice That Sticks, if you haven't read it, great book, got to read it. The only reason it's not back here is because it's on my iPad. But she says that client satisfaction in a first meeting, so basically a prospect, their satisfaction in a first meeting is directly connected to the amount of airtime that they get. So not how much time you spend telling them about how great you are and your process and your services and all the value that you provide. That's all good and important, but satisfaction is directly linked to the amount of airtime that they get.
Oh, that's amazing. All of a sudden, all these books are going through my mind that talk about this, and we'll have to save those for another day. Yeah. Additional action item, of course, would be, of course, to check out the Human Side of Money podcast, right? I think this is not a skill that you can say, well, someday I'll get to that. Like, this is a skill I'll get someday. It has to be something that's top. I would dare say that this is probably the most important skill that you can learn, because everything else you can ask somebody else about, right? Client asks me a tax question I don't know the answer to, I'll call Steven at Retirement Tax Services, right? They have a technical question I don't know the answer, I'll look that up. If I'm sitting across a client and I notice that their body language is shutting down, I can't ask for help there. Like, I've got to be able to respond in that situation.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Now, saying that it's one of the most important skills is just preaching to the choir, so all I'm going to do is praise that and affirm it. But so I've got action item items. I've got an action item and then a parting thought. So this
Please.
action item, it was one that surprised me, but as I went back and was reviewing the podcast episodes, the conversations, the research that I'd done, I realized that there's this one thing that advisors do that everybody that does it raves about. Right. And so I wrote an article about it the other day and mentioned like this has surprised me because it seems so simple, but the advisors that do it love it. And it's a discovery meeting recap email. Right. And I think a lot of people probably already do this. Right. But there's ways to do it better. There's ways to do it right. But it's simply after you have your first discovery meeting, either that later that day or no later than the next day, sending an email back to the client, basically recapping what the meeting was about. Now, not just recapping what you heard about their finances, not just recapping what you heard about their family, but really recapping what you heard and understood and the meaning of what they were saying. What was it that they're really there for? What's their emotional problem that brought them in? What is it that's most important to them that they want you to solve? And doing it in a way that's not just reciting facts, right? But making them feel like they were heard and understood. And what I hear from the advisors that say this is, like, you start getting emails back, like hearing things like, "Thank you so much. You heard me. I feel understood. You get me." And I can't imagine a much better compliment from a client than for somebody to say, "You get me. I feel heard. I feel understood." And I could be wrong, but actually, I don't think I'm wrong because I know most advisors don't get emails back like that, right? Very rarely do you send an email and get an emotional one back like, "You get me." So that's my action item takeaway, just because it's come up so many times. Second thing, I'm just going to leave a little parting thought out there, because I know you and I, we like to talk a lot on the value side of advice, right? There's people out there that like to focus on fee structures and fee compensation. You and I see eye to eye on this. Hey guys, we've got fee structures. That's great. Let's focus more on delivering massive value, if you will, right? And so yeah, right. Which, I mean, I use that all the time because I think it's a great way to say it. So for a second, I want to, I guess, explain the way that I look at the value of advice, or in other words, the ROI of financial advice. Okay, so if we're looking at value and, hey, how valuable is the service that we provide, we tend to measure and quantify the value of advice based on financial return, financial ROI, right? So if the client's paying me $10,000 per year for my services, I need to make sure to justify that I at least generate $10,001 in return. Now that's ROI. That's worth their investment, right? And it's completely normal, right? We focus on numbers, we focus on financials, we focus on returns day in and day out, but that's only one dimension of advice. So the ROI of advice has three dimensions. There's not just the financial return, but there's also the time that you're giving somebody, right? Our most precious, our most valuable asset, they're offloading the time to you. You're giving them more time back in their lives to do the things they love with the people that they love the most, right? But then the third dimension, which I would argue is probably the most important dimension, but it's the least talked about because I think it's the least quantifiable, is the emotional component, or the peace of mind that we deliver, that we can create for somebody, that that their finances are in order, that they're on track to do the things that they want to do, that they're living meaningful, fulfilled, purposeful lives because we've aligned their money with what's most important to them. The peace of mind that you can create for somebody might be the most unquantifiable, but at the same time, the most valuable. So if you think about it, the work that we do every day, we're doing something that offers more, or that creates more time, or sorry, let's do it back in order. That creates more money, more time, and more peace of mind. I would argue that there's no better deal out there than a financial advisor, right? I mean, that's the deal of the century. I don't care whatever you charge, it's probably not enough because you're creating more time, more money, more peace of mind in somebody's life. And I don't think you can find a better bang for your buck out there.
I love it. No, that's really critical. So important to look at. So important to look at, right? It's not just this alpha. That's almost like the last thing to measure. So, Well, Brandon, really appreciate your time today. Again, make sure everyone that you check out Brandon's podcast, The Human Side of Money. Love to have you back on to talk about our favorite books. I see both of us are avid readers, so that would be a lot of fun. Brandon, again, thank you for your time today, man. And everyone, until next time, happy planning.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.